Big Shaq steps into a luxury hotel, expecting peace, but instead he's met with quiet hostility. A racist woman tries to have him removed, unaware she's picking a fight with the wrong man. Just as security arrives, the real power player steps forward. And in a shocking twist, the hotel's fate changes forever. Because today, Big Shaq isn't just staying here, he's about to own it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden shimmer over the city skyline. Heat waves rippled off the pavement, making the towering palm trees appear to sway even when the air stood still. The Grand Eden Hotel, a beacon of wealth and exclusivity, loomed over the busy streets, a pristine structure of glass and marble, where only the elite gathered to escape the burdens of the outside world. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the hotel's grand entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the midday glare. The doorman, dressed in a crisp navy uniform, straightened his tie as the driver stepped out to open the back door. A pair of custom sneakers touched the pavement, followed by a towering frame that seemed to eclipse the sunlight for a moment. Big Shaq, his presence as commanding as his reputation. Despite his wealth, Shaq carried himself with an ease that made him approachable. He wasn't here to flaunt his money, nor did he crave attention. Dressed in a simple designer polo and tailored shorts, he looked like any other high-profile guest. Except he wasn't just anybody. His name carried weight, his legacy stretched far beyond basketball, and his heart was even bigger than his 7-foot frame. Yet in places like this, it wasn't his money or his kindness that people noticed first. It was his presence, his skin, and the unspoken assumptions that followed. Inside the hotel, the lobby was a scene of effortless luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast soft prisms of light across the polished marble floors. A jazz melody hummed from unseen speakers, blending into the rhythmic tap of expensive shoes against the floor. Guests lounged on designer couches, sipping imported wine, discussing investments and summer vacations in hushed, self-important tones. Shaq strolled past the reception desk, his deep voice offering a warm nod to the concierge who recognized him instantly. The staff knew better than to treat him like a stranger. He had stayed here before. They had seen the way he tipped generously, the way he took time to chat with employees, making them feel seen. But today, there was something different in the air. A shift, subtle but present. As he made his way toward the pool area, the atmosphere changed. The open-air space stretched before him like a scene from a luxury magazine. Cabanas lined the edges, occupied by guests sipping cocktails under oversized sun hats. The infinity pool sparkled under the sun, its water an inviting shade of turquoise, reflecting the clear blue sky above. Laughter echoed as children splashed near the shallow end, while couples reclined on lounge chairs, lost in their own worlds. Shaq took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of coconut sunscreen and the faintest hint of salt in the air. This was supposed to be a place of leisure, a moment of peace. He had come here for a break, to escape the noise, to exist without expectation. But peace, as always, was a fragile thing. A pair of eyes followed him as he stepped closer to the pool deck. A woman, draped in an expensive silk cover-up, lowered her sunglasses to get a better look at him. She was in her mid-50s, her blonde hair perfectly styled in effortless waves, her manicured fingers clutching a flute of champagne. The subtle crease in her forehead deepened as she watched Shaq move. Her gaze lingered too long, like she was assessing, measuring, deciding. Shaq felt it, but he ignored it. He had learned long ago that some people needed time to adjust to the sight of a black man in a space they considered theirs. He wasn't here for them. He was here to relax. He made his way toward an empty lounge chair near the pool, settling down with a quiet exhale. The sun was warm against his skin, the distant hum of conversations blending into the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over him. Then, a sharp voice cut through the tranquility. "Excuse me." The woman's tone was laced with something beneath her politeness. Something sharp, something practiced. Shaq opened his eyes, turning toward her. She was standing now, her champagne glass tilted slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you staying here?" she asked, her words slow, deliberate. Shaq didn't react immediately. He had heard variations of this question before, wrapped in different tones, disguised in different words. Sometimes it was curiosity. Other times it was something else. Something that had nothing to do with room keys and reservations. "Yes," Shaq said simply. His voice was steady, unreadable. The woman's eyes flicked to the pool, then back to him. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. Well, I assumed you were with someone." Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. She wasn't outright hostile. Not yet. But there was an edge to her, a discomfort she wasn't bothering to hide. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was gauging her next words carefully. "I mean," she continued, her smile tightening, "it's just that this hotel has a certain atmosphere, you know? A particular clientele. I wasn't expecting to see—" She hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't make her sound like exactly what she was. Shaq let the silence stretch, watching her squirm under the weight of it. "I just mean," she tried again, her voice lifting slightly as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "It's usually more private here, you understand." There it was. The coded language, the subtle attempt to make him feel like an intruder in a place where he had every right to be. Shaq had seen it before, in boardrooms, in country clubs, in spaces where his presence was questioned despite his wealth, his success, his reputation. He had learned how to handle it, when to engage, when to let it roll off his back. Today, he wasn't in the mood to play along. "I do understand," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, meeting her gaze with an unwavering steadiness. "And I think you should sit back down, finish your drink, and mind your own business." The woman's mouth opened slightly, as if she had expected him to react differently, to laugh it off, to reassure her, to shrink. Instead, he had given her nothing but directness, a reminder that she had no authority here. A flicker of something crossed her face, irritation, perhaps embarrassment. She huffed softly, turning away, muttering under her breath as she adjusted her sunglasses and sank back into her chair. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He wasn't angry. Not really. He was just tired. Tired of the way history echoed in moments like these. Tired of the assumptions, the expectations, the invisible lines that people still tried to draw. He had come here for peace, but peace, it seemed, always came with a price. As he leaned back against the lounge chair once more, he had no idea that this was only the beginning, that the tension simmering beneath the surface was about to boil over, and that before the day was over, this hotel, this space that had tried to push him out, would soon belong to him. But for now, he simply closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun settle over him, waiting for what would come next. Shaq had spent his life in the public eye. He was used to stares, on the court, in boardrooms, on red carpets. But there was something different about the way she looked at him. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't curiosity. It was something quieter, more insidious. The kind of look that wasn't meant to be noticed, but was meant to be felt. The woman sat just a few lounge chairs away, her posture stiff despite the relaxed setting. Her name wasn't known yet, but her type was unmistakable. She was wealth, old money, someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. Her platinum blonde hair was perfectly styled beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat, her designer swimsuit modest but expensive. A silk cover-up draped over her shoulders, and a diamond-studded bracelet dangled loosely on her wrist, catching the sunlight as she lifted her glass of chilled white wine to her lips. She had been watching him ever since he sat down. Shaq could feel it, but he had chosen to ignore it, at first. The other guests weren't oblivious. A couple beside her exchanged glances, their conversation faltering as they noticed her subtle disapproval. A man near the pool's edge shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his sunglasses as if he didn't want to be caught looking. The pool deck was suddenly filled with an unspoken tension, a quiet conflict brewing beneath the surface. Shaq had dealt with people like her before. The ones who didn't need to say the words aloud because their expressions, their body language, their carefully controlled reactions spoke for them. He knew the way they sized him up, looking for an explanation, for a justification, as if the sight of him in their space had to come with a reason. And then, as if she could no longer keep her thoughts to herself, the woman leaned toward the server passing by. She spoke in a low voice, but not low enough. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "Is he a guest here?" The question was pointed, wrapped in a thin veil of concern. The server, a young man barely out of his 20s, froze mid-step. His eyes flicked toward Shaq before darting back to the woman. A nervous energy settled over him, as if he had just been placed in the middle of something he wanted no part of. Shaq heard her. Of course he did. He wasn't far away, and she hadn't exactly been whispering. But he didn't react. Not yet. The server hesitated. Yes, ma'am," he said cautiously. "He's a guest." The woman pursed her lips, as if the answer wasn't quite satisfying enough. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her voice just a touch louder. Shaq exhaled slowly, running a hand over his bald head. He was a patient man. He had built his life on patience, on letting his game, his actions, and his success speak louder than the doubts of others, but patience had its limits. The server swallowed, visibly uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. "He's a guest, just like everyone else." The woman's expression remained unreadable for a moment. Then, as if deciding to take matters into her own hands, she turned her gaze directly to Shaq. "I'm sorry, she started, feigning politeness. "I wasn't expecting to see someone like you here." There it was. The real meaning behind her question. The unspoken barrier she had constructed in her mind. The invisible rules she believed this place followed. Shaq finally met her eyes, holding her gaze with a calm steadiness. "And what exactly does someone like me mean?" he asked, his voice even. The woman hesitated, as if realizing she had been caught saying something she couldn't easily take back. She gave a practiced, rehearsed laugh, one meant to sound light-hearted, but carried no real amusement. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way," she said quickly. "It's just that this is a very exclusive resort. Very private. Usually it's, well, a certain kind of crowd." Shaq didn't blink. He had heard those words before. They came in different forms, wrapped in different tones, but they all meant the same thing. He let the silence stretch between them. For the first time, the woman looked slightly uncomfortable. Perhaps she had expected him to brush it off, to let it slide, to make it easy for her. Instead, he let her sit in it. A few other guests had noticed the exchange now. They weren't jumping in, but their eyes flicked between Shaq and the woman, their silence loud in its own way. Finally, Shaq leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Well," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I guess today's a day for surprises." The woman opened her mouth, then closed it. She had lost control of the conversation, and she knew it. Still, she wasn't done. A moment later, she turned to the hotel staff member stationed near the pool entrance. "I'd like to speak with the manager," she said crisply. The young staff member hesitated. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes," she said, her voice hardening. "I think there's been a mistake." Shaq felt the shift in the air instantly. She wasn't just questioning him anymore, she was escalating, and he had a feeling this was about to get a lot worse. The air around the pool had changed. What had been a lazy summer afternoon filled with quiet conversations and clinking glasses was now thick with tension. Some guests pretended not to notice, shifting their gazes to their phones or adjusting their sunglasses. But they felt it. Everyone did. The woman sat upright in her lounge chair, her wine glass forgotten on the small table beside her. The arrogance in her eyes had hardened into something colder, something sharper. She wasn't just irritated anymore. She was determined. She had spoken, she had questioned, and she had not received the answer she wanted. Now, she was going to make sure someone listened. She lifted a manicured hand, snapping her fingers toward the young poolside attendant. The sharp snap cut through the murmuring conversations, making the young man flinch as he turned to her. "Get the manager," she ordered. "Now." The attendant hesitated. His nervous gaze flicked between Shaq and the woman, as if trying to gauge the safest response. Ma'am, he said cautiously, I don't think. Now, she interrupted, her voice leaving no room for discussion. The young man gave Shaq a brief, apologetic glance before nodding and hurrying toward the hotel entrance. Shaq didn't move. He remained stretched out in his chair, one ankle resting over the other, arms folded across his broad chest. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something still, something measured. He had been here before in different ways, in different places, and he knew how this would play out. The woman cleared her throat and turned her attention to the surrounding guests, suddenly playing to an audience. I'm so sorry, everyone, she said, raising her voice just enough to carry. I don't feel safe. There it was. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Some people visibly tensed. Others shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had been trying to stay out of it couldn't ignore the way the accusation lingered. Shapeless, but heavy. Shaq's jaw tightened for half a second before relaxing again. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. One of the guests, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, adjusted his watch and cleared his throat. I mean, he said awkwardly, he's literally just sitting there. The woman turned to him with a sharp smile. Of course, she said, her voice light, dismissive. But I know how these things go. One moment it's all fine. The next, people like him start making a scene. Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. People like him. He had heard those words before. They came in different tones, in different places. Sometimes they were muttered in the back of a boardroom, sometimes written between the lines of a policy, sometimes whispered in the nervous shift of a security guard's stance. It was never about what he did. It was about what they expected him to do. And now, they were waiting. Waiting to see how he'd react. Waiting to see if he'd prove her right. The glass doors of the hotel swung open, and a man in a navy suit stepped onto the pool deck. He was tall and lean, his dark hair slicked back with corporate precision. The name tag pinned neatly to his chest read, Patrick Winslow, General Manager. The woman's expression shifted into one of relief as she gestured toward him. Oh, thank God, she said, standing up. Finally. You need to do something about this. Patrick's sharp eyes moved from the woman to Shaq, a flicker of recognition flashing across his face before he quickly masked it. His posture stiffened, his professional smile tightening as he approached. Ma'am, he said smoothly. Is there a problem? Yes, she said, exasperated. I don't know how he got in here, but he's making me very uncomfortable. He's sitting here like he belongs, and frankly, I don't feel safe. Patrick's lips parted slightly, as if trying to process the absurdity of the complaint. He looked at Shaq, who remained silent, watching. The weight of the moment was suddenly placed in the manager's hands, and he knew it. This was a delicate situation. The woman was a guest, a regular guest by the looks of it. She carried the air of someone with power, someone who could call corporate and have heads roll if she was displeased. But the man sitting across from her wasn't just any guest. He was Shaquille O'Neal, a global icon, a man whose face had been on billboards, whose presence had shaped industries. Patrick was caught between two forces, two unspoken expectations, and for a long, heavy moment, he said nothing. The woman seized the opportunity. You do have a policy about outsiders, don't you? She pressed. I mean, this is a high-end establishment. You can't just let anyone walk in off the street. Patrick inhaled sharply through his nose, his hesitation growing more obvious. He was weighing his options. He knew there was no reason to remove Shaq. He also knew that not removing him would upset a guest who clearly had influence. And then, finally, he spoke. Sir, he said carefully, turning to Shaq. Do you have a reservation with us? The question settled over the space like a brick dropped in water. The woman's lips curved into a victorious smirk. Shaq let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward the manager and raised an eyebrow. Do you? He asked. A beat of silence. Patrick shifted on his feet. Shaq didn't let him finish. He reached into the pocket of his tailored shorts and pulled out a sleek black room keycard. He held it up between his fingers, letting the gold lettering catch the light. Penthouse Suite. Patrick's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. The woman's smirk wavered. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Man," he said, his voice deep and smooth, but laced with something colder. "Y'all really love asking me if I belong somewhere, huh?" Patrick opened his mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. "I own more businesses than I can count," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I've signed million-dollar deals in places like this. I could probably buy this hotel if I wanted to." The woman's face paled slightly. Shaq stood, towering over them. "But you're standing here, trying to decide whether I belong here." Patrick's face burned red, the realization of his mistake settling in. "Mr. O'Neill, I didn't mean—" Shaq held up a hand. "Don't worry," he said. "I know exactly what you meant." A thick silence settled over the pool deck. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others looked away entirely. The woman, for the first time, seemed genuinely uncertain. She had expected security to remove him. She had expected the weight of her discomfort to outweigh the reality of the situation. Instead, she had played herself. Shaq turned to her, his gaze calm but unyielding. "I ain't going nowhere," he said simply. She swallowed hard, looking away. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tugging at his tie. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for—" Shaq didn't let him finish. He reached into the pocket of his tailored shorts and pulled out a sleek black room keycard. He held it up between his fingers, letting the gold lettering catch the light. "Penthouse Suite." Patrick's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. The woman's smirk wavered. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Man," he said, his voice deep and smooth, but laced with something colder. "Y'all really love asking me if I belong somewhere, huh?" Patrick opened his mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. "I own more businesses than I can count," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I've signed million-dollar deals in places like this. I could probably buy this hotel if I wanted to." The woman's face paled slightly. Shaq stood, towering over them. "But you're standing here, trying to decide whether I belong here." Patrick's face burned red, the realization of his mistake settling in. "Mr. O'Neill, I didn't mean—" Shaq held up a hand. "Don't worry," he said. "I know exactly what you meant." A thick silence settled over the pool deck. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, others looked away entirely. The woman, for the first time, seemed genuinely uncertain. She had expected security to remove him. She had expected the weight of her discomfort to outweigh the reality of the situation. Instead, she had played herself. Shaq turned to her, his gaze calm but unyielding. "I ain't going nowhere," he said simply. She swallowed hard, looking away. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tugging at his tie. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for—" Shaq didn't respond. He simply sat back down in his chair, picked up his drink, and took a slow sip. The message was clear. The conversation was over, but the real reckoning was just about to begin. Shaq stared out over the shimmering surface of the pool, his drink untouched in his hand. The tension still hung in the air, but he had learned how to let it pass over him, how to let it settle without letting it sink in. He had spent a lifetime mastering that skill, but just because something rolled off his back didn't mean it wasn't felt. As he sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle, something pulled him backward, not physically, but deep inside, to a place buried beneath years of success, wealth, and status. A place where moments like this weren't just incidents but lessons. 35 years earlier, the Florida sun had been just as unforgiving then, drenching the neighborhood basketball court in sticky heat. 11-year-old Shaquille stood at the free throw line, gripping the worn leather of a basketball. His oversized hands nearly swallowed it whole, but his grip was strong, his stance solid. The other kids on the court, most of them smaller, lighter, quicker, watched him with mixed expressions. Some admired his size, knowing he had an advantage. Others, though, had something else in their eyes. Discomfort, resentment. They didn't say it outright, but he could hear it in the way they muttered to each other when they thought he wasn't listening. "He's too big to be our age. Bet he's dumb, though. Why's he even here? He should be playing somewhere else." Shaq knew what they meant. Somewhere else. somewhere they didn't have to share their court with him. That day, he had ignored them, just like his mother always told him to. He had dribbled the ball, lined up his shot, and let it fly. The ball had soared through the thick, humid air, spinning in a perfect arc before sinking into the net with a swish. But instead of cheers, there had been silence. Then, one of the kids, Bradley, a wiry boy with a freckled face and something mean in his eyes, had let out a sharp laugh. "Lucky shot," he had sneered. Shaq had said nothing. He had learned early that words weren't always worth the fight. Bradley hadn't liked that. "What, you think you're better than us?" he had challenged, stepping closer. "You think just 'cause you're big, you can come here and take over?" Shaq had kept his eyes on the ball as it rolled back to him. Bradley had scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't belong here, man." The words had stung, not because they were new, but because deep down, even as a kid, Shaq had known that this was going to follow him. Everywhere. No matter how good he was, no matter how much he proved himself. He had clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around the ball. He could have shoved Bradley aside, could have used his size, his strength. But then, "Shaquille," a voice, steady and warm, had cut through the moment. Lucille O'Neill stood at the edge of the court, her arms folded, her eyes sharp but filled with something deeper than anger. She had watched the whole thing. Shaq had exhaled slowly, forcing his grip to loosen. Without a word, he had dribbled the ball once, twice, then passed it to one of the other kids and walked toward his mother. The walk home had been quiet at first. Shaq had kicked a loose rock down the pavement, his mind still, replaying the words. Finally, he had muttered, "I could have shoved him." His mother had stopped walking, turning to face him. "And then what?" Shaq had frowned, shifting his weight. "He'd know not to talk to me like that." Lucille had studied him for a long moment, then crouched slightly so she was eye level with him. "Baby," she had said gently, "there are always going to be people like that. People who want to push you down because they think you don't belong." Shaq had swallowed, his young face still set in frustration. "But listen to me," she had continued. "Winning isn't always about fighting." Shaq had frowned. "Then what's it about?" Lucille had reached out, resting a strong but gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's about standing tall," she had said. "When they try to break you down, you don't fight. You rise." She had let the words settle, watching as her son absorbed them. Then she had given his shoulder a light squeeze. "Come on now, let's get home before dinner gets cold." Shaq had followed her, the words still echoing in his head. Present day. He blinked, the memory dissolving as the present came back into focus. The tension at the pool had eased slightly, though eyes still lingered on him. The woman, though clearly embarrassed, wasn't retreating just yet. She sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers tapping against the stem of her glass. Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. Winning isn't about fighting. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to prove anything. Instead, he did what he had done all his life. He stood tall, and something told him, this battle wasn't over yet. The silence was thick, stretching across the pool deck like a dense fog. The woman sat with her chin lifted, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her confidence barely masking the discomfort settling into her expression. The hotel manager, Patrick Winslow, stood awkwardly between her and Shaq. His face a careful mask of neutrality, though sweat had begun to bead at his temple. He was stuck, caught between a complaining guest and a man whose reputation alone could bury this hotel in bad press. And then, as if the situation couldn't escalate further, the double glass doors leading into the hotel swung open again. This time, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the pool deck. A murmur passed through the guests. A few people reached for their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Some looked at Shaq with pity, others with curiosity. But no one stepped in. They just watched. Shaq remained seated. He had been here before. Not in this exact scenario, but in enough variations of it to know how it played out. Security would approach, all professional politeness at first, but firm. They would ask him to leave, maybe frame it as a misunderstanding. He could push back, but that would only feed into the story the woman wanted, one where he was the problem. His mother's words echoed again. Winning isn't about fighting. It's about standing tall. So Shaq stayed still. He let them come to him. Patrick turned to the officers, adjusting his tie with forced authority. Gentlemen, I need you to escort this. He hesitated, catching himself. This guest off the premises. The officers exchanged glances before stepping forward. And then, stand down. The voice cut through the air like a razor, strong, commanding, the kind of voice that could freeze a room. Every head turned toward the entrance. A man, older, tall, dressed in a linen suit with an effortless air of authority, walked onto the pool deck. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his deep brown skin marked with the wisdom of years. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the space. Patrick's face drained of color. Sir, The man held up a hand, silencing him. His sharp eyes flicked to the security guards. You may go. The officers hesitated, then nodded, stepping back without another word. The woman, still perched in her chair, straightened. And who are you supposed to be? She asked, her voice carrying forced confidence. The man turned his gaze to her, unblinking. I'm the owner of this hotel. The air seemed to leave the pool deck all at once. A slow ripple of realization passed through the watching guests. Some of them whispered to each other, piecing things together. A few even smirked, clearly enjoying the turn of events. The woman's face faltered. She started, but the words dried up in her throat. The owner turned to Shaq, his expression unreadable. And then, a slow smile. My friend, he said warmly, stepping forward and extending a hand. Shaq stood, towering over everyone, and shook his hand with ease. There was familiarity there, respect, something deeper than just an exchange between a hotel owner and a guest. Patrick looked like he might faint. Sir, The owner didn't look at him. He was still focused on Shaq. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, he said. I would have stopped this nonsense earlier. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. It's all good, man. I've seen worse. The woman's mouth opened and closed, struggling to process what was happening. Finally, she forced out, This must be some mistake. I was only concerned for the safety of the guests. The owner's expression hardened. No, what you were doing was profiling a man who had every right to be here. She flinched as if slapped. That's not... The owner ignored her, finally turning to Patrick. And you. You didn't even bother to check the facts before trying to escort one of our most important guests out of my hotel. Patrick swallowed hard. I was only trying to de-escalate the situation. The owner scoffed. By siding with ignorance? The guests were no longer whispering, they were listening. The woman, now desperate, pointed at Shaq. Why are you acting like he is the victim? You're defending him like he's some kind of VIP. The owner cut her off. He is more than a VIP. A pause. And then, with a quiet but undeniable force, the owner said, Shaquille isn't just a guest here. He's a potential investor in this hotel chain. The woman's face went slack. Patrick swayed slightly, as if reality had just punched him in the gut. I had no idea. You didn't ask, the owner said sharply. A wave of realization spread across the pool deck. Guests who had been silent now looked at Shaq with something different in their eyes. Some with embarrassment, others with admiration. The woman's confidence had shattered completely, leaving her sitting there, small and insignificant in the weight of her own mistake. Shaq, for his part, just sighed, shaking his head. Man, it's always the same story. The owner placed a hand on his shoulder. It doesn't have to be. Shaq studied him for a moment before nodding. The owner turned back to the woman. Ma'am, you have two choices. You can apologize right now, publicly, or you can leave. She bristled. I paid for my stay, and I'll gladly refund you every penny, the owner said without hesitation. She looked around as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But there was no support left. The crowd had shifted, their silence now a verdict. Slowly, reluctantly, she stood. Her face burned red, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without another word, She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pool deck as she disappeared into the hotel. Patrick looked like he wished he could do the same. The owner exhaled, then turned back to Shaq. "We have a lot to talk about, my friend." Shaq smiled. "Yeah, I think we do." And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. The woman stood frozen in place, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of her silk cover-up as if it could shield her from the weight of the moment. Her once arrogant expression had collapsed into something between shock and indignation, her mind scrambling for a way out. The murmurs among the guests had swelled into a quiet storm, rippling across the pool deck like a wave. Some people turned their heads, pretending they hadn't been watching, while others leaned in, eager to witness the final blow. There was no escaping this now. The hotel owner, his silver hair gleaming under the afternoon sun, stepped forward. His linen suit, crisp and effortless, contrasted with the hard edge of his expression. He was a man who had seen wealth in all its forms. Old money, new money, the desperate, the privileged. And yet moments like these reminded him how little had changed. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but laced with quiet disappointment. "Tell me, ma'am," he said, eyes locked onto hers. "What exactly made you feel unsafe?" The woman's lips parted, then closed. The silence stretched. A few feet away, Shaq remained seated. He could have stood, could have loomed over everyone, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. He sipped his drink, watching, waiting, letting the weight of the moment settle where it belonged. The woman swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening. I didn't mean unsafe in that way," she stammered, forcing out an uneasy laugh. "I just meant I wasn't expecting his kind of presence here." A sharp inhale from someone in the crowd. A woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat shifted uncomfortably in her lounge chair. The salt and pepper-haired man near the pool let out a low whistle under his breath. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. His kind. Even after being caught, even after the truth had unraveled in front of her, she still couldn't say it outright. The owner let her words hang in the air for a moment before he responded. "And what kind is that exactly?" His tone was gentle, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath it. The woman hesitated, her breath quickening. Her fight-or-flight instincts were kicking in, but there was nowhere to run. She was drowning in her own words. I didn't mean it like that," she said finally, her voice thinning under the pressure. The owner tilted his head slightly. "No? Then tell me, how did you mean it?" Another stretch of silence. The woman's face turned pale. Her confidence, the same confidence that had made her snap her fingers at a server, that had made her demand the manager, that had made her so certain she was right, was crumbling. Shaq had seen it before. The moment when the realization hits. When people like her, people who have lived their entire lives believing they belong in every space, are forced to confront the fact that their entitlement has limits. Finally, she looked down at her trembling fingers. Her nails were still perfect, her jewelry still sparkling. But her world had shifted, and there was no undoing it. The owner exhaled slowly, his disappointment palpable. "This hotel," he said, his voice steady, "is a place of business. We cater to people from all walks of life. The idea that someone, anyone, could be judged not by their actions, but by who they are." He shook his head. "That is not how we operate." The woman flinched, nodding weakly, still avoiding eye contact. Then, he turned to Shaq, his expression softening. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, "I can't apologize enough for what you just experienced. No matter how much success you have, no matter how many doors you've walked through, it is unacceptable that you still have to deal with this." Shaq let the words settle before responding. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice deep, slow, measured. "It happens more than you'd think." The crowd was still. No one dared to interrupt. The owner's jaw tightened. "I'd like to say I'm surprised, but I'm not." Patrick, the manager, stood to the side, looking as though he wished he could vanish. His usual corporate composure had evaporated, replaced by quiet shame. He had been so quick to assume, so quick to side with the wrong person. Now his boss was standing here, undoing everything he had let happen. The woman inhaled sharply, forcing herself to straighten. I didn't mean to cause such a scene, she murmured. Shaq huffed a quiet laugh. Oh, you meant to? His eyes met hers, not with anger, not even with amusement. Just truth. You just didn't think it'd turn out like this. Her lips pressed together, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The owner turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You should go. She flinched. But I'll have the front desk process your refund, he continued. You're no longer welcome here. A stunned silence followed. For the first time, she looked small. She hesitated, glancing around as if waiting for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But there was no lifeline left to grab onto. Slowly, she picked up her things, her movements stiff and jerky, her hands trembling as she shoved her towel into her designer tote bag. The power she had wielded so confidently just minutes ago had slipped through her fingers. Shaq watched as she turned, walking toward the hotel doors with her head ducked low. He didn't feel satisfaction. Not exactly. He wasn't the type to celebrate someone else's downfall, but he was the type to recognize when a lesson had been served. As the doors closed behind her, a breath of release swept through the crowd. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Someone let out a low whistle. The owner turned back to Shaq. I wish that never had to happen, he said honestly. Shaq nodded. Me too. A beat passed. Then the owner offered a small, knowing smile. But I have a feeling this isn't the last conversation we're going to have today. Shaq's lips curved slightly. No, he agreed. I don't think it is. And with that, the truth had been laid bare. The woman was gone. The tension she had stirred up still lingered in the air, but the weight of it had shifted. What had begun as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something else entirely, something bigger than the humiliation of one entitled guest. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet hum of realization moving through the pool deck. The people who had watched in silence, who had let the moment play out without stepping in, now looked at Shaq differently. Some with respect, some with quiet guilt, some with something deeper, an understanding that they had just witnessed a moment they would never forget. The hotel owner, standing tall beside Shaq, exhaled slowly. He had handled difficult situations before. Running a luxury establishment meant knowing how to balance diplomacy with authority. But today had been different. Today had forced him to confront something that had always lingered beneath the polished surface of places like this. And he was done ignoring it. He turned to face the guests, his voice steady, but filled with purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. I know this wasn't what anyone expected to witness today. The murmuring around the pool quieted instantly. He continued, his deep brown eyes scanning the crowd. I built this hotel to be a place of luxury, of exclusivity, but not exclusion. A place where anyone who has earned their way here is treated with the respect they deserve. He glanced at Shaq. And today, I was reminded that success doesn't always erase the barriers people try to place in front of you. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman in oversized sunglasses shifted uncomfortably. A man near the cabanas crossed his arms, deep in thought. The owner took a deep breath. That's why I've made a decision. A pause. Patrick, the hotel manager, stood stiffly to the side, his face pale, already sensing that whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. The owner turned to Shaq, his expression unreadable. You and I have had conversations before, he said, his voice carrying weight. About business, about opportunity, about what comes next. Shaq nodded slowly, his face giving nothing away. The owner let a small smile break through. I think this moment just told me exactly what needs to happen next. The air around them seemed to still. I'm stepping down as the owner of this hotel, he announced, his voice unwavering. And I'm handing over the deed to Shaquille O'Neal as part of a new partnership. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was stunned. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, a wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "No way." A woman near the bar dropped her sunglasses onto the table with a soft clink. Even Patrick looked like his legs might give out beneath him. Shaq just blinked. He had expected a conversation, a potential business opportunity, Not this. He let out a slow breath, studying the man in front of him. You sure about that? He asked, his deep voice carrying a quiet, measured respect. The owner smiled knowingly. I've never been more sure of anything. Shaq didn't answer right away. He glanced around, taking in the stunned faces, the shifting expressions. He wasn't blind to what was happening here. This wasn't just about ownership. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about change. He exhaled, shaking his head with a small chuckle. Man, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Did not see this coming today. A few people in the crowd let out nervous laughs, the tension cracking just slightly. Then Shaq's expression grew serious again. He turned back to the owner. If I say yes, he said, this place has to change. No more of what just happened today. No more of that. The owner nodded. That's exactly why I'm giving it to you. Shaq inhaled deeply. He wasn't a man who made decisions lightly, but he also knew when the universe was handing him something bigger than himself. He extended his hand. The owner grasped it firmly. And just like that, the balance of power shifted forever. The guests, still absorbing what had just happened, erupted into murmurs, some in shock, some in quiet excitement, some in pure disbelief. Near the pool entrance, the woman, had reappeared just in time to hear the announcement. Her face drained of color, her fingers clutching the strap of her designer bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She had spent the entire day trying to make Shaq feel small. Now, he owned the very place she had tried to push him out of. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Instead, she turned sharply, her heels clicking against the marble as she stumbled her way toward the exit, disappearing from sight. Shaq didn't watch her go. He didn't need to. He had bigger things to focus on. A new chapter had just begun. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick and electric. Conversations buzzed across the pool deck, disbelief and admiration mixing together like ripples in water. Some guests whispered in shock, others simply sat frozen, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most recognizable names in the world, was now the owner of the very hotel where he had just been humiliated. And yet, as Shaq stood there, his towering presence unmistakable, he wasn't basking in victory. He wasn't interested in revenge or gloating. He had never been the type to hold grudges, not even when he had every reason to. A hotel staff member hesitated before stepping forward, handing him a microphone. The owner nodded toward him in encouragement, stepping aside. Shaq turned it over in his large hands, staring at it for a moment before bringing it to his lips. The murmurs died down. The pool deck stilled. And then, in that deep, unmistakable voice, Shaq spoke. Man, he exhaled with a small shake of his head, his tone easy, almost amused. What a day, huh? A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Some guests, still uneasy from everything that had happened, shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward, waiting to see where this was going. Shaq let the moment breathe before continuing, his voice steady. I've been in a lot of places. Locker rooms, boardrooms, studios. I've met presidents, kings, CEOs. But no matter how much I accomplish, no matter how much I give back, I still get moments like today. A few heads nodded. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. It's funny, ain't it? You can be a millionaire. You can be a business owner. You can walk into a place like this with all the credentials, all the money, all the respect in the world, and still, somebody will look at you and think. He paused, scanning the crowd. He don't belong here. The weight of his words settled over the guests like a thick cloud. I saw it today, he continued. Some of y'all saw it too. And most of y'all didn't say nothing. A few people shifted in their seats uncomfortably. I get it, he said, his voice softer now. A lot of y'all didn't want to get involved. Maybe you didn't know what to say. Maybe you thought it wasn't your business. But let me tell you something. He paused, his eyes scanning every face in front of him. This is your business. Silence. Racism ain't always loud. It ain't always burning crosses or shouting slurs. Sometimes it's quiet. It's a look. A hesitation. A question that shouldn't even be asked. His grip tightened slightly around the mic. It's a woman snapping her fingers at a waiter, demanding to know if I really belong here. It's a manager standing there, hesitating, trying to figure out if it's safer to side with the problem than to stand up for what's right. Patrick, still standing off to the side, swallowed hard and dropped his gaze. Shaq let that sink in before he continued. Look, I ain't mad. I've been black my whole life. I know how the game is played. He paused, his eyes flicking toward the entrance where the woman had disappeared minutes earlier. And I ain't here to trash nobody. I don't need to. What just happened today? He let out a dry chuckle. That was enough of a lesson on its own. The crowd remained eerily still, every word he spoke pulling them in deeper. Shaq inhaled, then exhaled slowly. But this ain't just about me. He looked around, making sure they were really listening. This is about all the people who don't have the kind of name I got, who don't have the platform I got, who walk into places like this every day, spending their hard-earned money, and still gotta deal with people looking at them like they don't belong. He paused, his expression firm. That's who I'm speaking for right now. A heavy silence stretched across the pool deck. No one dared to move. Shaq nodded to himself, then looked at the owner. I respect this man right here. I respect that when the moment came he stood up, but respect don't come from one moment. He turned back to the crowd. It comes from what you do after the moment's passed. The owner nodded solemnly. Shaq let the words settle before delivering his final thought. This isn't just my win, he said, his voice softer now. It's a lesson for all of us. And then, a slow clap. At first it was just one person, a man near the back, then another. Then, like a slow-building wave, more and more guests joined in. The sound grew, spreading across the pool deck, turning into something bigger than applause. It was acknowledgement. It was a shift. And then, before Shaq could even process it, a standing ovation. People rose from their seats, some hesitantly at first, then all at once. The applause was loud now, steady, thunderous. A few guests wiped at their eyes, overcome by something they hadn't expected to feel today. Patrick clapped too, his face still marked with quiet shame, but also something else. Understanding. The owner stepped forward, shaking Shaq's hand once more, his grip firm. Let's make some real changes, my friend. Shaq nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yeah, he said. Let's. And just like that, this wasn't just a lesson. It was the start of something new. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the ocean waves rolling onto the shore. The Grand Eden Hotel, now under new ownership, stood bathed in the soft glow of golden lights. From the penthouse balcony, Shaq could see the city skyline stretching endlessly into the night, the world moving forward, as if the events of the day had been nothing more than a ripple in time. But he knew better. This wasn't just another day. This wasn't just another win. This was the start of something bigger. Shaq exhaled, his breath steady as he leaned against the railing. The day had been long, but the weight of it was different now. Lighter. He wasn't the kind of man to celebrate too soon, but there was a satisfaction settling deep within him, a feeling that something had shifted, not just for him, but for the people who had witnessed it. He glanced at the deed sitting on the sleek glass table behind him, the papers neatly stacked. His name was on it now. His name, in ink, owning something that had once been a place of exclusion, of quiet judgment. Not anymore. The soft sound of laughter from below pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, looking down at the pool area where the water reflected the twinkling lights above. The energy had changed since earlier. Where there had been tension, there was now ease. Guests sat around the fire pits, talking freely, some still murmuring about what had happened. A few of the staff moved with more confidence, heads held a little higher, as if they too had been given permission to take up space. And then, Shaq's eyes landed on a boy sitting at the edge of the pool, his small legs dangling just above the water. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Something about the kid looked familiar. Curious, he pushed off the railing and headed downstairs. The boy didn't notice him at first. He was too busy staring at his own reflection in the water, lost in thought. He was no older than 10, his sneakers untied, his t-shirt slightly too big for him. Shaq stepped closer, keeping his voice easy. "Pool looks nice, huh?" The boy flinched, whipping his head around. His eyes widened as he looked up at Shaq, way up. "Whoa," the kid breathed. "You're huge." Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The boy blinked, then blurted, "Are you really the new owner?" Shaq glanced at the hotel, then back at the kid. "Yeah, guess I am." The boy considered this, kicking his feet slightly. "So, does that mean you can, make the rules now?" Shaq grinned. "Depends on what kind of rules you're talking about." The kid hesitated, then looked down at his hands. "My mom says places like this aren't for people like us," he mumbled. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He crouched down so he was at eye level with the boy. "What's your name, man?" The boy hesitated, then said, "Jalen." Shaq nodded. "Well, Jalen, let me tell you something." He pointed at the hotel behind them. "You see that building?" Jalen nodded. Shaq tapped his chest. "It's mine now." Jalen's eyes widened again. "For real?" "For real." The boy seemed to process that for a second. "So, what does that mean?" Shaq smiled. "It means your mom was right, before today, but not anymore." Jalen stared at him, unsure of what to say. Shaq patted his shoulder. "Next time someone tells you a place isn't for you, you look them in the eye and say, 'Not yet.'" He leaned in slightly. "Then you go out there and make sure it is." The boy didn't respond right away, but Shaq saw something change in his expression. A flicker of understanding, of belief. After a moment, Jalen smiled. "You're kinda cool," Shaq chuckled. "Appreciate that." From a few feet away, a woman in a simple dress stepped forward, smiling gently. "Jalen, it's time to go." Jalen hopped up, glancing back at Shaq. "You gonna make this place better?" Shaq nodded. "That's the plan." Jalen grinned. "Good." Then, just like that, he ran off to his mother, grabbing her hand as they disappeared into the night. Shaq stayed there for a moment, watching them go, something deep in his chest settling. He turned back to the water, the reflection of the stars shimmering on its surface. For the first time in a long time, he felt it. Not just victory, not just success. Change. Real, undeniable change. And as the night stretched on, Shaq O'Neal, businessman, athlete, and now, owner of something far greater than a hotel, smiled. Because he had just rewritten history in his own way. And this? This was just the beginning. Some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. Moments like these happen every day. But how many times do they end with real change? The next time you see injustice unfold, ask yourself, will you be a silent observer or will you be part of the shift? Because history isn't just made by those with power, it's made by those who refuse to look away.